Let's be real for a second. Navigating romantic relationships, it can sometimes feel like you're just stumbling around in the dark, right?
Oh, absolutely. So many people hit the same roadblocks again and again.
Exactly. Wrestling with the same old doubts or
Yeah.
falling into patterns that, well, they just don't seem to work.
Yeah,
And you're left wondering why it keeps happening.
it's incredibly common. And the chapter we're looking at today, it offers a really powerful way to think about that. Why?
Okay.
It makes a pretty strong case that a lot of what we go through as adults in relationships is actually deeply shaped by our very first bonds, with our parents or whoever raised us way back.
Wow. Okay. That definitely makes you pause and think. So this deep dive, it's based on this section about attachment styles.
That's right. And the core idea is that figuring out those early dynamics is kind of the key to unlocking why we struggle now.
Got it.
So our mission here is really to unpack the four main attachment styles that the material talks about, see how they show up in our adult relationships, and pinpoint the specific challenges tied to each one.
Sort of using this framework to help you, the listener, get a clearer picture of your own patterns, maybe.
Precisely. Hopefully giving you some tools for self-understanding.
Okay, so this foundational idea from the source, it's that our romantic relationships aren't totally separate things. They're often like echoes of those childhood bonds.
That's the crucial insight, yeah. The chapter highlights something potentially quite difficult, which is that many of us, without even realizing it, spend our lives sort of recreating the relationship dynamics we first learned with our families.
Like an unconscious blueprint guiding us.
Exactly. Directing your choices, your reactions, all often happening beneath the surface.
And these attachment styles, the four of them, that's how we start to understand this blueprint. Let's start with the one that sounds like the ideal, secure attachment.
Right. So secure attachment. The chapter explains this typically develops when a child's parents or their main caregivers were consistently attuned to their needs. Really reliable.
So if the baby cried, someone came. If they were happy, someone shared that.
Basically, yes. The child learned, okay, the world is generally safe. People can be trusted.
Which, according to the material, means folks with this style tend to struggle the least in relationships,
Yeah.
objectively speaking. They don't overreact to potential rejection, that fear isn't as loud for them.
Exactly. But here's where it gets interesting. The source points out a struggle even securely attached people might face.
Oh,
Complacency.
complacency? That feels odd. If you're secure, shouldn't relationships be smoother?
You'd think so, wouldn't you? But the idea here is they might stay in relationships that are just fine. Good enough. They stay too long because it's comfortable, it's easy.
No, okay. And the flip side,
The flip side is when a really amazing connection, something potentially great comes along, they might actually hesitate, pull back a bit.
because going for something really worthwhile feels riskier than staying in that comfortable zone.
Precisely that. Stepping into something truly meaningful means, well, there's more at stake, more to potentially lose. They value that equilibrium sometimes, maybe, at the expense of what their heart truly wants. So the takeaway there, according to the source, is needing to open up to the reality that, yeah, real love, worthwhile love, is a bit scary. It involves risk.
So take your time, but don't just default to the easy path.
Right. Face the discomfort for potentially greater reward.
That's really fascinating. Okay, moving on from secure. Let's talk about avoidant attachment. Where does this one come from, according to the chapter?
This style often traces back to having parents who were emotionally unavailable or maybe insensitive when the child did express needs.
Okay, so a very different early experience.
Definitely. These kids often learned early on to be like little adults, very self-sufficient. The material describes them as avoiding showing pain or needing help, especially from their parents, because maybe it wasn't met with comfort, maybe it was ignored, or even, met with irritation or shame.
So they learned, it's safer to rely on myself than to reach out, leading to this high value on independence.
Exactly. Sometimes almost to a fault. They become very self-contained, often most comfortable when they're alone.
And how does this play out in adult intimacy?
Well, the chapter points directly to intimacy issues. They struggle to feel safe showing their whole self, vulnerabilities and all, to a partner.
And the core struggle there.
It's because they've learned to associate any kind of, quote, imperfection, needing something, making a mistake, showing strong emotion with dismissal or rejection.
Because that's what happened. Opening up led to being shut down or shamed.
That was the perceived danger, yes. So they operate from this deep-seated belief that if they're completely genuine, completely themselves, it'll inevitably lead to being unloved or pushed away, because that's the lesson their early environment seemed to teach them.
Wow. And the source also mentioned something about how they view flaws.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. They can be incredibly tolerant and understanding of other people's flaws, but have almost zero tolerance for their own. Any sign of their own imperfection feels deeply threatening.
That sounds like a really heavy weight to carry. So what does the analysis suggest helps someone with this pattern?
It's really about practice. Gradually practicing vulnerability, maybe starting small, perhaps with friends they trust, opening up a little bit about something real.
And seeing what happens,
Yeah.
seeing they don't get rejected.
Exactly. Seeing that people won't disown them or shame them for just being human. As that trust in others starts to build, and maybe more importantly, trust in their own acceptability, then genuine intimacy starts to feel less terrifying.
Okay, makes sense. Let's turn now to the anxious attachment style. The source links this one to inconsistent parenting, right?
That's the key word, inconsistent. Sometimes the parents were warm, attuned, nurturing. Other times, maybe they were intrusive or overwhelming or just insensitive and dismissive.
So the child never knew which version they were going to get.
Right, and that inconsistency creates this kind of constant low-level hum of anxiety. The chapter suggests this often leads to struggles with indecisiveness and a real fear of the unknown because their early world felt so unpredictable.
How does that uncertainty play out in adult relationships then?
It makes trust really hard because, trust needs some level of predictability, some consistency, but paradoxically,
Yeah.
they often become really intensely attached, clingy even, sometimes just to the idea of a person, not necessarily the reality.
Why is that? If trust is hard, why the intense attachment?
The chapter explains it as a reaction to that fear of the unknown. Anything outside the relationship they're holding on to feels deeply unsafe. So clinging, even to something not quite right, feels like a way to manage that overwhelming anxiety about what might happen if they let go.
Okay, so the struggle isn't always about the other person necessarily, but more about managing their own internal anxiety.
You've got it. The material really emphasizes that. They spend a huge amount of mental energy mind reading, assuming the worst, projecting fears, trying to predict outcomes.
Try and control the uncontrollable, basically.
Exactly. All to try and shield themselves from potential pain or abandonment. Or they just flat out refuse to let go of a relationship, even one that's clearly not working, because the fear of what if I never find anyone else is just too powerful.
That sounds absolutely exhausting, constantly living in your head in those future what-ifs.
It really is. The core issue identified is being guided more by what they're desperately trying to avoid: pain, uncertainty, being alone, rather than what they actually want to create or experience in a connection.
So the path forward involves
Learning to recognize that the intense anxiety, that urgency they feel, is often generated internally. It's a product of those learned thought patterns, not always a reflection of the immediate objective reality.
so doing the work to separate reality from those fear-based stories.
Yes. Refocusing those anxious thoughts, checking them against reality, and very intentionally surrounding themselves with people who are genuinely trustworthy, reliable, and caring. Building real evidence against the fear.
Okay, that leaves one more style, disorganized attachment. And this one, the source says, stems from some really difficult beginnings.
Yeah, perhaps the most challenging. This style is often linked to parents or caretakers who were themselves a source of fear. Maybe abusive, frightening, or even perceived as life-threatening to the child.
That's a terrible paradox for a child. The person you depend on for survival is also the person hurting you or scaring you.
Exactly. There's no safe base. The attachment figure is the main source of distress. The chapter explains that to survive this impossible situation, the child often had to start dissociating.
Disconnecting.
Yeah, disconnecting from their feelings, their bodies, the reality of what was happening, really as a way to cope, just to endure the unbearable.
And how does that coping mechanism, born out of necessity, create struggles later in adult relationships?
Well, because they essentially learned to switch off or ignore their internal experience to survive, the chapter notes they often struggle to listen to their own emotional navigation system as adults, their gut feelings, their intuition.
So they might choose partners who aren't good for them,
Mhm.
or ignore red flags.
Right, because they were effectively trained not to trust themselves. Trusting their feelings as a child in that environment might have felt dangerous or just wasn't possible. They were in pain, that maybe had to pretend everything was okay, convince themselves it was fine just to get through.
So that learned pattern of self-distrust continues.
Precisely. That inability to trust their inner guidance becomes a major hurdle. The analysis suggests that healing from this requires some pretty serious mental and emotional work.
Like what kind of work?
often involving carefully processing past trauma, understanding the narrative they built to survive, and consciously working to rewrite it based on their adult reality. And critically, learning to reassociate with that inner guidance system.
Learning to hear and trust that inner compass again, the one they had to mute.
Yes, learning to value and trust their gut feelings, their emotional responses, their intuition, maybe more than the thoughts or beliefs that were originally just survival tactics in an unsafe world.
Wow. This whole exploration, just based on this one chapter, really maps out how these deep-seated childhood patterns can manifest as really distinct struggles in our adult love lives. It's not just random.
It's definitely not random. And the power in understanding these styles, it isn't just about putting a label on yourself or someone else. It's recognizing that the pattern you might be stuck in isn't just bad luck.
It's a learned dynamic.
Exactly. And the crucial part is if it was learned, you can learn something different. Recognizing your style, seeing it clearly, that's the absolute first step toward being able to change those automatic reactions.
It really does feel like turning on a light in a room you didn't even realize you were bumping around in.
And if you think about your own experiences listening to this, those moments of maybe confusing anxiety or that strong pull to withdraw or finding yourself in that same frustrating argument again, could that be an echo?
An echo of one of these earlier patterns playing out now.
Possibly. And that leads to maybe the biggest takeaway thought this chapter leaves us with.
Yeah.
What would it actually look like day to day, relationship to relationship, if you consistently chose based on what your heart truly wants now, what feels genuinely right and healthy for the adult you, rather than being driven by those old survival programs or comfort zones you learned way back when?
Moving from just reacting based on old fears to intentionally choosing based on current truth and desire.
That journey from where those patterns began to truly trusting your own inner guidance today. That's profound work. But recognizing the pattern you're in, maybe thanks to understanding these styles a bit better, that's such a powerful place for you to start.